Me and my entire family, including aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, we've encountered odd things throughout our lives. Not sure if it's a ghost, angel, demon, or what we've all separately experienced is something different. I plan on posting them, but I'll start with my experience as a kid. When I was 6 years old, I remember having the same dream every night for months. In the dream, I'd wake up and I'd look under my bed to glowing eyes staring at me. Then I'd be chased by this tall, dark figure. Every kid has nightmares, but what was scary is when I would wake up, I would hear a man whisper my name.
Elizabeth. Elizabeth. Elizabeth.
In my ear. I still honestly remember the voice. It was calm and monotone. I'd get out of bed to look around the house and see who's calling me, and whenever I looked in the kitchen, the clock on the oven always said it was around 3 a.m. Then, I'd make my way to my parents' room and ask if they were calling me, and they obviously weren't, and I'd end up sleeping at their feet. My mom said she remembers me waking them up every night. That's my first experience, and it's kind of creepy, but I never thought it was that deep until I learned so much more about my family members and what they've experienced. It makes me think that maybe the voice wasn't just in my head. When I was around 11 years old, my parents got a divorce, and that meant selling our house. I had the choice to stay with my mom or my dad, which, by the way, it's a really shitty choice to give a kid, but it's fine. Long story short, I chose my dad because I didn't want him to live alone. I knew my mom would be fine. Plus, my mom would probably just end up picking me up a lot of the time anyway, so it felt like the better of the shitty choices. So my dad ends up moving into a mobile home park, somewhere further than my mom, just outside of Fresno, in a little place called Clovis. The mobile home is nicer than I expected to be. Right away, I could see that I had my own room. I wasn't sure my dad was going to even think about that sort of thing in his mad dash to find a place. You could tell that old people used to live here. The coloring on the walls, blush tones, floral print, thick shag-like brown carpet. That weird old wood paneling covered the walls in all the places that weren't covered in wallpaper. The only place I'd seen anything quite like it was my granny's house, and she was old, so old people. I set up my bed and decided to go cruise the little neighborhood, see what the deal was as far as other kids go. I noticed almost immediately that it wasn't just my dad's house that was old school. Every single one of his neighbors, they had to be in their 60s or 70s. I get to the end of the loop, pretty quickly learning that there's just one exit in and out of this place, which seems like some sort of hazard or something. I turn my bike around, and standing in front of me is a super old woman, wearing nothing but a nightgown. A filthy one at that. She scares the crap out of me, and I jump back a bit. She takes a step towards me, and before it registers, she disappears. I don't know if I blinked or what, but this woman just vanished. I power biked it home to my dad's, and I ran inside. He's telling me to stop slamming doors. Something about taking off my shoes. Like, what? He's not even a shoes in the house kind of guy. But I comply, while not taking my eyes off the window to the outside. I tell my dad straight up, some old lady really just disappeared in front of me. It sounds insane leaving my lips, and my dad laughs. While walking into the other room, he says over his shoulder, "Yeah, everyone here is pretty old. Old is scary, huh?" He keeps laughing, even after leaving the room. judging by how dismissive my dad was, not worried. I decide, okay, so I definitely didn't see that. Like, I made it up, and that's crazy, but maybe that's something that happens sometimes. The sun was going down. I would have told myself anything to believe that a scary old woman didn't disappear in front of my eyes. And of course, something happens as I'm getting ready for bed, and of course, it's terrifying. While my dad and I are watching TV, I keep feeling as though something is moving around in my room or watching me. Like the light from the outside was shining through the bedroom window, and I could see the light through the side crack in the door. But every couple of minutes, something would block that crack of light, as if someone was standing behind the door. Without much thought, I start to head towards my room to see what this trick of the light was. I go to open my door all the way and it stops, like something really is behind it. I turn to look, and as I do, I see something standing before quickly disappearing, causing me to sort of fall into the door and down a bit. There was no longer something behind the door. My dad asks me, what is it with me and doors, and telling me to leave it alone. So I just decide to close the bedroom door and keep watching TV. I want to ignore this, but I can't, because now I can see the light being blocked from underneath the door. Again, as though someone is standing on the other side of it. I tap my dad and I ask him, doesn't it look like someone standing in my room? And I pointed to the door saying, look at the light. He's watching, but nothing happens. I tell him to wait because it will, so he does. It's still not happening, but of course, right when he looks away, it happens. Someone moving on the other side of the door. I tap my dad, and as I do, my bedroom door handle moves slightly, the way that it would if you were opening it from the other side, followed by it immediately opening very slowly until it was fully open. A huge piece of me wants something more to happen so my dad can witness it with me. And like it could read my mind, the door starts to close, ever so slowly. I grasp my dad's arm and I ask him what the hell that is. And he sort of lets out a sigh or a gruff, saying, well, obviously you falling and hanging on the doors isn't good for them. Guess you get to have the wonky door in the house. Sorry, kid. Was this man serious? Not even remotely rattled at a door opening and closing by itself? I tell my dad I'm not sleeping in that room, and he tells me like hell I'm not. He didn't splurge on 2 bedrooms just so I could sleep in the living room. So that plan goes out the window. Bedtime. I remember that night I prayed. It makes me chuckle because I wasn't like a religious kid. Sometimes my granny would make me go on an occasional Sunday, but that was it. However, when you're desperate, God seems like about the only option. I was asking for kid shit like, please don't let any old ladies in my room. Please let me have cool dreams. Stuff like that. Going to bed, I kept my window shades open and my door cracked so that I could have some light. I actually fell asleep pretty easily, but then I woke up. At first, I just laid there, wondering why I felt weird. And then I realized that the room was pitch black. The curtains were closed, my door was closed, but also, someone was with me. At first, I just felt their presence, but then, the feeling of someone climbing into bed with me, the covers being moved, the bed indenting slightly, and a horrible sound. It was like someone struggling to breathe through mud. I still hear it in my head sometimes. I have nothing to relate it to outside of this experience, but I just laid there, keeping my eyes shut tightly. I knew I wasn't paralyzed, but I was still afraid to move, so I screamed. It was the loudest scream I think I've produced, but oh, did it work to get my dad's attention. He comes crashing into my room, and to my horror, he shouts, "Who the fuck?" Before quickly turning on the light. I hop out of bed and over to my dad. He's still in some sort of state of shock because he doesn't immediately embrace me. It's only after I say "Dad" over and over again through crying that he looks down and proceeds to pick me up. He shuts my door and takes us both into his room, where we spend the rest of the night. It took me a while to fall asleep, but even when I did, my dad was still awake. I don't think he slept a wink that night. He never made me sleep in that room again. He actually made me stay with my mom while he looked for somewhere new to live. He never told me exactly what happened, what he saw, just that he didn't like that place. But you know I got the scoop from my mom when I was older. She couldn't wait to tell me because she loves that spirit stuff, ghosts and everything. My dad, he saw someone laying in my bed, but he saw someone standing over me too. But more, he saw them everywhere. Multiple shadows or figures standing in my room, most of them close to me. It was scary enough, all of it, but goddamn, I'm glad I never opened my eyes. Union Cemetery in Connecticut is known to be one of the most haunted in the country. You can research yourself, but there's a lot of people who have seen the White Lady there. My family, who lives near the cemetery, told me of the legend, saying that normally people will see green mist or sparkle, and then they'll usually see her from their car. Whenever I visit them, I pass the cemetery more than 5 times a day. It's definitely creepy looking. About 20 years ago, when my aunt and her family moved there, they all went and got ice cream one night. On the way home, they were all looking to see if they could spot the ghost. One of my younger cousins was acting very weird when they got home. He told his sister that he saw the woman, but they were just kids and she thought that he was just trying to scare her. That night, he woke up, screaming and crying. His mom and sister went to calm him down, but he didn't stop. Every night, he woke up crying and screaming, talking to someone, sleepwalking, all the stuff you could imagine. And whenever they tried to calm him down, he was totally unaware of anything that was happening around him, as if he was in another world. They'd shake him aggressively, and he wasn't responsive, ever. My aunt said that she took him to see a spiritual doctor, and it was the doctor who healed him. Nothing has happened to him since. Fun fact, Ed and Lorraine Warren, the one the Conjuring movies are based off of, lived less than 10 minutes from my family's house. I drove by it last year, and it was crazy to think that the Annabelle doll was in that house. Lorraine wanted to visit my cousin's high school because the catacombs were supposed to be haunted, but the school didn't let her. My husband and I bought our first home almost 2 years ago. It's near the local cemetery. I say near, but it's more like the cemetery is our backyard. There's several rows of trees and a tall wooden fence that separates us from the cemetery. This aspect has never bothered us. We actually like being able to access the cemetery. It offers a decent walking path, and for the most part, I've always found them rather peaceful. If it's important, this cemetery, our house, and a few other houses are spread out at the end of a long dirt road. Our house was absolutely off the grid, which we appreciated. The town itself is sort of small, with a heavy population sitting mainly together in the center. A few large farm properties before getting to the outskirts, the cemetery, the forest, our property, and more forest. My point being that there's just not a lot of people out here. One of my favorite things to do is to walk my bird around outside in the mornings. It sounds silly, but we're talking about an umbrella cockatoo, one of the largest and most affectionate birds around. My beautiful bird is Bono, and yes, Bono is still around. He will likely outlive me and my husband. But anyway, Bono normally asks me to go for the walk, sort of how you would ask a dog to go for a walk. This is because shortly after I got Bono, I moved in with my husband, who was my then boyfriend, and shortly after that, he decided to adopt a dog, whom we named Snoopy. The two animals had coexisted for the first 4 years of Bono's life. The first phrase Bono ever learned was naturally the one that he'd heard the most, or maybe he just was fond of Snoopy's reaction to the question, "Want to go for a walk?" Sadly, Snoopy passed away due to a form of terminal blood cancer. It was 4 years after we adopted him. I wouldn't say that Bono was totally depressed, but he certainly missed his pal. When my husband and I stopped asking to go for a walk, Bono started asking instead. It made me incredibly sad. However, one day he started adding, "Bono, go for a walk." And this made me laugh. I picked him up and I took him outside for a walk, and the rest is history. He doesn't fly, he just sits on my shoulder, walks around on my shoulders, that sort of thing. So our routine was to take a couple of laps around the walking path, and then I'd let Bono chat with me and maybe other birds while sitting on this really large stone bench. The bench has a perch that Bono likes to sit on. One morning, early into our move to the new place, my morning walk with Bono was a little different. We had been walking our second and last loop before sitting down. I felt like Bono was being extra fidgety, hopping from shoulder to shoulder a bit more frequently. And then he started making noises. I started to get nervous until I realized that the sounds were familiar. The noises that Bono was mimicking was a whistle. He just hadn't made them since Snoopy passed away. I felt a little less uneasy, but I was curious. Maybe there was a dog in the park. I hadn't seen anyone walking their dog, but maybe someone had a new morning routine. I turn around and we're alone. No people, no pets. Bono then starts to rock back and forth, excitedly. Another move that he would do when Snoopy was around. Suddenly, I felt something brush past my legs. It startled me so much that I jumped and likely made a noise. This caused Bono to laugh at me in his best bird laugh, and he immediately followed it up with, "Silly Snoopy." And I froze. Standing there, I listen as Bono repeats it over and over. "Silly Snoopy, silly Snoopy." I see nothing, no explanation for what has just brushed past me. Within a few steps, we make it to the stone bench. Bono proceeds to hop onto his perch, and he says things like, "Good Snoopy," and "Snoopy kisses," followed by kissy noises. While sitting and observing my bird, a sudden warmth is felt to my left, just below Bono's perch. I can't really explain why I did this, but I found myself moving my hand over to pet the warmth to my left. When I did, I felt nothing physically, but I swear my entire body was saying Snoopy. And then I felt the warmth sort of disappear. For about a half a second, I felt really silly. But almost immediately after the warmth had left my side, I hear, "Good Snoopy. Bye-bye, Snoopy." Turning to look at my bird, I see he's still excited, rocking back and forth. "Bye-bye, Snoopy." He stops with all the familiar noises shortly afterwards, and for a few minutes we just sit. I remember crying, but not because I was sad or anything. Honestly, I was sort of moved by the whole thing. What I find so special and so strange about this encounter is Bono had never made these noises or had these conversations, not on our walks through the same area, and he hasn't done it since. Shortly after, I recall asking Bono on one of our walks, "Snoopy?" And he actually responded to me, saying, "No, Snoopy, ha ha." And also, just to say it, before this, I had never experienced anything like it, and I haven't since. The feeling of a phantom dog or phantom anything brushing against me, the warmth, it all felt like it really meant something. Oddly enough, my husband had a dream about Snoopy that same morning. We just hadn't talked about it yet. He's not sure about the whole thing being paranormal or connected, but he agrees that it's definitely strange and cool. When Snoopy left to the puppy hospital that day, over a year ago, none of us knew that it would be the last time we saw him. But at least my husband and I got to say goodbye, you know? Part of me feels like this was actually Snoopy saying goodbye to Bono. So I don't know that we'll ever encounter him again, but I'm glad we all shared this moment. Hug your pets and have a blessed day. I've lived in this house for almost 4 years now. For a while, my bed would be in the corner of the room, but facing the door. Every night, without stopping, I'd feel a presence in the doorway, standing there, watching me. No matter how many times I've turned on the light to see no one there or in the hall, I always feel it watching me at night. I was robbed about a year ago, and I was trying to de-stress, and as I walk out of my room, a girl looks up and stares at me. I think she's one of the robbers, but as I chased her out of the house, I reached the kitchen, and as I went to the front door, I saw it was locked, with a chair in front of it, the way I'd left it. To say the least, I was terrified, but I didn't act like it, because if you show your fear, that's what they'll feed upon. So I moved my bed to the other side of the room, which made me put my full body mirror to the wall, facing the door. I just wanted a difference to try to feel better. The first night felt fine, until I looked in the mirror, and I felt like I was about to see someone jump out of it. Luckily, I fell asleep before anything like that could happen. A few years later, I'm still here. I feel them all the time, but I never let them know. When they do things, I pay them no mind. If I ever get out of this hellhole, I'll let you guys know. Until then, hello from the mover house, because they really like to move things. If you have any questions, I'm open to answering. And to the people wondering why I do nothing, this isn't the first time I've seen ghosts or had to deal with them, and it's the smartest way for me to not make them angry or upset. Ignore them. I grew up in an incredibly old farmhouse near York, Pennsylvania. It dated back to 1796. It was added on to and expanded almost 6 or 7 times. What began as a plot of 50 acres was trimmed down to 10 when I lived there, 2008 to 2018. I believe I experienced firsthand a prime example of an energy haunting or a possible poltergeist that latched onto me. I always felt a tangible sense of being watched or stalked everywhere I went in the house. I was shaking with fear at all times, if not occupied with something to do or having people around. This sensation, it didn't stop from the time I was 9 years old to 19 years old when I moved out. My father was a manipulator, a verbal and physical abuser, possibly bipolar, BPD. I would later discover I'm most likely the same way. I grew up incredibly sensitive. Everything was overly intense on all spectrums of feelings. Scary people were extra scary. Loud things were extra loud. I was able to be overly happy and also soul-crushingly sad. I began to suffer from severe manic depression, possible ADHD, and bouts of hysterical sadness that plagued my high school years. This has continued into adulthood, something I struggle to maintain grip of. My mother is a major empath, feels emotions incredibly intensely as well, good and bad. Things started mild, consistent footsteps and boards creaking all throughout the nights. When we were young, these examples were brushed off as old house, old bones from my parents. There was certainly old house dryness or energy stiffness. It felt unsettling when you were inside by yourself. It felt like the house was alive, yet somehow incredibly dead and heavy, with just, emptiness. All of my friends from their young ages through high school, they all said it just had a feel to it. This house has been lived in feeling, or an intimidating feel. The early years. My brother and I shared a room for the first few years. Around month 9 or 10 after moving in, our bedroom door was slammed nearly off the hinges in front of my wide-awake, alert eyes. It was around midnight on a Saturday. It was storming out, and all of the windows, they'd been closed, leaving no possible draft. My brother woke one night to use the bathroom when he was maybe 10 years old. Directly across from the toilet, you could see out the window and into the driveway about 20 yards away. He said he saw multiple shadow people moving around the area. We had a garage light that illuminated the space. He told me in tears the next morning. I was plagued with peripheral vision, shadow people, during the day. I was going insane thinking I was catching things out of the corners of my eyes. I watched a full-bodied, 10-foot black shadow move from the hallway light into the dark of my shared room along the wall. It moved along the wall like a rectangular, vertical blob of shadow energy. I watched it dissipate after staring frozen in fear for nearly an hour. My mom told me for years that she consistently heard old record music, 40s or 30s radio-esque tunes, coming from upstairs while alone during the day. My mom was a homemaker, so she spent her days cleaning and prepping meals, laundry, etc. Well, she was downstairs in the basement on 2 occasions when she reported to us that she heard an animal-like, heavy scurry across the floor of the house from above her, only to investigate and find no signs of activity upstairs. My dad had his back turned to the living room every morning when he would get ready for work. Standing to eat breakfast at the kitchen island, his keys and belongings were in a drawer inside. He would leave early, around 4 or 5 in the morning. He said one morning he felt the hair stand up on his neck, like his gut told him something was behind him. He swears that he turned and he caught the tail end of a white gown or dress, like someone had just walked out of frame from the living room entrance as he turned to look. He started turning all of the downstairs lights on in the mornings. I want to tell the whole story and where it leads to. It's disturbing, but I hold great pride in what a great house it still was for my childhood experience. A house is a house. The things abiding in it are a different story. My middle school years. Just a loud bang. After my brother and I had split rooms, I used to go into my bedroom closet, and if I knocked on the wall, he would hear it against his bedroom wall. He knew it was me every night, and he'd still get super spooked. This was a ritual for a few weeks. This happened one night. He got particularly upset and screamed to stop. My dad yelled from downstairs to knock it off and to go to bed. I stepped into the bathroom to brush my teeth, and I heard the loudest slam I couldn't have conjured in my head. It was like an anvil was pushed off of a shelf and onto the floor, or like a car had slammed into a telephone pole. My brother screamed, "I told you to stop!" My heart sank into my stomach, and I was immediately flooded with tears. I begged my father to believe it wasn't me that time. The cuckoo clock. I had friends sleeping over downstairs in the living room with me. We were hanging out late one night, and we had this amazing old German cuckoo clock. It was on the wall. It hung for decoration. It never worked. I went upstairs to get some toiletries for the night, and I heard a loud giggling from beneath me. I came back, and there was noticeable chatter and shrieks for a moment. "What's up?" I asked, and they replied, "Your clock went off and it scared the shit out of us." I told them, "That clock doesn't work. It's never worked." They fully described the doors opening, the little men dancing, making music, and then it stopped. In the middle of me saying something like, "That's not possible," it went off as I was standing beside it. We got rid of the clock. She's coming down the stairs. That very night, we were all asleep in the living room. The wooden boards of our staircase were so old and creaky, it was actually obnoxious to walk on. It was so loud to traverse the steps, it would likely wake someone up. One of my friends woke to the sound of slow, heavy creaks, one by one, down the staircase. There may have been one living room lamp light on, but as you looked into the kitchen, the lights would have been pitch black, and the staircase off to the left was accessed from the kitchen. He heard the last step at the bottom make a noise, and then silence, as if someone had stepped onto the relatively quiet ceramic tile of the kitchen floor. No one appeared to be in view. Frozen in fear, he called out my dad's name. It was the only foreseeable person to be coming down so heavy-footed in the middle of the night. He called out a second time and gets no answer. He never heard anyone go back up the stairs. He stared into the kitchen, paralyzed. He told us the next morning that he turned all the lights on and waited out the night. He didn't come back for a few weeks. The progression was slow, few and far between, but when things happened, they were so intense and noticeable you didn't forget them. Rising tensions with my father, coming of age, and inner issues began to plague my subconscious. Starting high school, dating, pressures, sports, doing horrible in school, all compounded to the hours I spent locked in my room, night after night, for years, drowning in self-pity and hatred and sadness, only to be interrupted by hanging out with friends or family gatherings. I was an incredibly happy and popular kid who was already building this inner alter ego whom only I knew. The real kid, suffering alone. High school, 2013 to 2015. Walking in your sleep. I began sleepwalking again about this time, something I hadn't done since I was very little. Now, some 6'2", and mostly grown, it was probably a sight to see. My mother reported me coming downstairs on 2 occasions and looking at her with nothing eyes and mumbling under my breath shortly after going to bed. I'd crawled into my parents' bedroom, nearly naked. I'd woken up in the bathroom another time. The list goes on. Not once did I have any momentary recollection of these happenings. First contact. I was screaming into a pillow until I couldn't stay awake anymore. I was crying until it felt good to fall asleep. I was stressed, sleep-deprived, anxious, and drowning in priorities. I believe certain people are energy hotspots. People in low places, having the power to send a beacon to spirits or entities that are wanting to latch onto something with a feed potential. I began counseling treatment for chronic depression. This is always why I believed that other than my brother and father's one-off experiences, my mother and I had the most consistent reportings of things happening. We were beginning to be called crazy or egging it on. I slept with my phone beside me on a nightstand every night, face down with a rubber case. I woke to the sound of a sudden rumble or patter, crash from across the room. Something heavy that had hit the floor and tumbled around for a moment. I reached for my phone, and it wasn't there. In the dark, I stood and walked to the light switch by the door, across the room by 12 feet. And at the foot of the door was my cell phone. I was baffled. How could it have just fallen off the nightstand but traveled 10 plus feet? And it didn't roll there. It was dropped there, like it had been airborne for a moment. After a few moments of lying in confusion, it was as if somebody blew a hard exhale in my left ear, like a hot, breathy pressure that was immediate. I slapped the side of my face in a jerk reaction. I just felt really helpless. Second contact. On a separate night, I woke to the sound of a parachute pants-like whoosh, like something of that material was being rubbed or dragged, and felt a slight pressure sensation at my feet. I've always tucked the end of my bed sheets in because I like that locked-in feeling when I sleep. I reached for my cell phone flashlight to quickly scan the room, and with my own eyes, I saw the corner of my bed sheets sticking straight out towards the center of the room, like someone was pulling it off of me. The split second I flashed the light onto it, it dropped immediately. I was too scared to speak, to call for help, to do anything. I didn't move for a few hours, terrified beyond belief. There's more to the stories the rest of the time we spent there, but I'll have to write that out at another time. Thanks for reading. We used to always go camping in the spring, my brother and I. We could get away with it because we grew up in Southern California, so it's basically always camping weather. Used to. The past tense being that my brother's not around anymore. He's since died. He died in all of this COVID stuff, actually. He just needed some treatments, you know. Things he couldn't be getting for a while there. Vital stuff, you start to see that. Just a little too late. Well, I'm pushing 50, and he was about 6 years older than me. We weren't exactly going camping regularly when he passed anyhow. But when we were, our only rule was a new place every year. Plenty of places for us to set up for a few days. Plenty of places where we didn't really need to hit the same spot twice. Too much to see or whatever. We'd either go northeast towards Big Bear or just south a little bit towards Cleveland National Forest. Well, this particular year we camped inside of Joshua Tree Park. We'd been in the area before, just an entirely different area of the park. This area was Indian Cove Campground. Real nice place. Not sure if it's still the case on account of us never going back. The whole place is right off one of the main highways into the park, and Joshua Tree in this area resembles a desert. There aren't a lot of trees around in this area, so this wasn't us in the middle of the forest. Essentially, it's a cove of rock formations. Where we set up was in the middle of the camp, the rocks forming a sort of horseshoe around us. A small hike up and around the rocks would take you to the restrooms. Honestly, it's one of the less secluded areas that we'd ever been to, yet somehow it still managed to be the only place that's ever actually scared us. After setting up, we hiked for quite some time, going the distance and tiring ourselves out pretty good before the sun started making its way down. As we headed back to camp, I thought it was just me feeling a little strange, until my brother piped up from behind me. "What is that, you think? That sound?" I hadn't been hearing any sounds. It just felt like someone was near us, like we were being watched. I told him, "I don't hear anything, but let's pick up our pace." It wasn't but maybe 10 seconds that had passed when I hear something. It sounded like someone was above us, like maybe walking on the rocks or scaling them. In a few places, the trails dipped behind these rock formations, and I started feeling paranoid that someone was trying to keep themselves concealed behind them. My brother, on the other hand, took the noise to mean that there was just another hiker. "Oh, that's not the sound I heard earlier. That sounds like someone's hiking." We were both wrong. As we got closer to the end of the trail, where the other trail eventually feeds into it, it was pretty clear that there were no other hikers. I walked down the trail just a little bit, behind the rock wall. My brother was confused, asking me why I was heading that way. I told him I don't like the idea of someone hiding out here so close to our camp. But next he made a good point. The sun was going down quickly, and within a few minutes, we'd be out here in the dark with no light source. We decide that we'll go back to the campsite, grab some flashlights, and come back just to be sure no one was hiding away. Back at the campsite, it was dark now. We'd set up some lanterns and took a flashlight with us to check the rocks. Before approaching the entrance of the trail, I heard something moving from above us. My brother does too, and we point our lights up, but we see nothing. I should clarify, my brother and I walking around the park after sundown, it's frowned upon. I started to feel a bit goofy though, searching for who knows what. And then we heard it again. It sounded like something was scaling the rock wall. But these weren't the kind of rocks that you could just climb. They were smooth and rounded in a way that would offer zero grip. And the sound, it didn't just happen and stop like before. It kept going. And now, standing at the entrance of the trail, the sound echoed. It was blatantly obvious. We looked at each other. His face shows me that we are still hearing the same sound. Our flashlights were now wildly bouncing around. We would have expected to at least see an animal, but there was nothing. Just the sound of something large scaling the rocks. Then, our flashlight catches the glimpse of something. It's only for a moment, but it's enough to end the search and send us running in the other direction. What we saw, it was something long, pale, skinny. It was almost transparent. It was a limb of some kind. It was unclear if it was an arm or a leg or what, but it definitely wasn't human. We ran. I kept looking back. I saw nothing, but we both heard a screech. A loud one. And look, I've got nothing to compare the screech to. I've heard screeching owls. I've heard bats, big cats, coyotes, people, tires, all the screeching things, and nothing has ever come close to what we heard. We didn't stay about another 10 minutes, packed up our gear, and decided to head back south, home. We'd make up for it about a month later, camping elsewhere. But at the time, there was nothing we wanted more than to just go home. We hardly even spoke until we'd been on the road for about an hour. Even then, we were silent with our theories for several years. No idea what we saw that night, but it was enough to send 2 grown men running. So, I don't think I'd choose to encounter or mess with that thing again. Any idea what we saw all those years ago? Has anyone else ever had strange experiences at Joshua Tree? This happened to me about 10 years ago when I was 14. It was a warm summer night in 2012. I was walking around the city with my friends, R, who was 16, and his older cousin Jay, 24. We'd all been neighbors for about 4 years now. Our families knew each other, so it was quite normal for us to all be hanging out together, despite the age gaps. During our walk, we decided to take a shortcut through the cemetery. It was after hours, and I'm pretty sure it was illegal for us to be there, but at the time, we weren't going to do anything other than just cut through, which we would often do during the day as well. As we were walking down the path, I saw headlights turn into the cemetery, and the boys, of course, darted away ahead of me into the trees. Since the others ran ahead of me and off the path, away from the lights, it was pitch black. There was residual light twinkling through the branches as I made my way down into the trees, but it dropped down to a slight hill, and the light was lost. I was walking along, trying to be as quiet as possible, almost blind due to my eyes not adjusting yet, and that's when the feeling of dread sets in. I had no idea where the guys were. I couldn't see, and I didn't want to be caught by the police by myself. But there was something else, almost a chill in the air on a warm July night. I tried to brush it off, the uneasy feeling, thinking it was just my nerves being scared because the guys took off without me. But alarms were going off in my head, like something was very, very wrong, and apart from legal reasons. I should not be there. I make out a shape to the left of me. As I'm walking, I take a couple of steps towards it. Guys, is that you? Nothing. No response. I take a few more steps towards it, and I swear to God, just like the movies, a freaking twig snaps under my foot. Now, the reason I had thought that it was the guys is because this shape was crouched down next to a pile of brush, and it was big enough to look like 2 people hunched over. I thought that they had been hiding there, but when the twig snapped, I stopped in my tracks as the thing stood up and towered over me. I was about 5 foot tall at the time, and this thing was easily 2 of me stacked right on top of each other. Whatever this thing was, it was only 15 feet or so away from me, and I was frozen in horror. It was facing away from me at first, and then its neck, its head, it almost swiveled around like an owl, and I was met with an oval-shaped gray face. No nose or mouth. Only 2 pitch-black, hollow eye sockets. The rest of this thing's body was pitch black against the dark trees. The light from the path no longer streaming through the branches. It was just me and this thing that seemed like the personification of darkness itself. This thing and I stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. The woods around me, through the corners of my eyes, were getting darker. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it through my entire body. Every tiny hair on my body was prickling. I was cold. The only thing I can remember thinking was, this is it. I'm never going to see my family again. The body of this thing had followed its head and swiveled, so now I could see its long, curved arms held right up to what would be this thing's chest. Its legs were similarly curved, almost like it wasn't standing at full height, but still slightly crouched down. Its body was almost translucent. It looked like it was wearing some kind of hooded cloak that was see-through as well. The only thing that was 100% solid was its face and its void-like eyes that made me feel like I was staring right into the depths of hell. Neither of us moved. We were locked in the most terrifying staring contest. It felt like an eternity, until a strange feeling came over me. I felt like I could move again, and I had the energy to run a 5K marathon without breaking a sweat. Then I heard a very calm but stern voice say, "Go. Now. Run." It's kind of hard to explain where the voice was coming from exactly. It was sort of in my head, but all around at the same time. I'm getting chills as I write this. I know the voice did not come from whatever this thing was in front of me, because when I heard the voice speak, it looked as if this horrid creature recoiled at the sound of it, like it took a step or two backwards and kind of ducked its head down. I saw this as my chance, and I turned away from this thing, and I started bolting down further into the tree line, and no longer caring about being quiet and crashing around through the bush like an animal being chased by a predator. I could almost feel this thing right on my tail, but after running about 200 feet-ish, I run directly into the guys, literally crashing into them. I'm obviously scared and pissed, so I ask why the fuck they left me out there like that, and they apologized. Apparently, I'd been missing for almost a half an hour, and they'd already searched the direction I ran from. They heard weird whispering all around the woods while I was gone, like the voices were coming from everywhere around them. They said right before I crashed into them, the whispering stopped. I told them about what I saw, and all they said was that we should get out of there. We left the cemetery very quickly, and as soon as we walked out of the gates, it was like we all let out a sigh of relief. We never talked about that night again, and even during the day, none of us ever took that shortcut through the cemetery. I still live in the same city, and to this day, I avoid it like the plague. I won't even drive by it. This isn't my only story, but it's definitely one of the more terrifying ones that still haunts me to this day. The Bothell Hell House, Poltergeist, and the Disappearing Cross. I'll always remember the events of this day. It was the weekend that Captain America, the Winter Soldier, came out in the United States, April 2014. A month before the movie came out, My cousin flew in from Dallas, Texas, and stayed with me and my girlfriend up near Seattle, Washington, a small town called Bothell. My cousin had been aware of our ghost, so to speak, meaning she knew just enough to still want to come. To be safe, she brought a cross with her, a gift for me and my girlfriend, hoping that the cross would protect us. Written on it were the chapters Joshua 1:9, Phil 4:13, Psalm 28:7, and Matthew 19:26. Each verse spoke about maintaining one's strength, one's faith during troubling times. My girlfriend and I had been having strong poltergeist-like activity, so reading something like this was extremely helpful. When my cousin arrived, she handed me the cross. We prayed over it and placed it over our bed. That's where my cousin said it would protect us. Keep it above your bed in your bedroom. A month later, the cross went missing. Understand, missing objects, religious objects specifically, is not a new phenomenon in our house. Things get taken all the time. Sometimes they return, sometimes they don't. The items that do return are never found in their original spot. This cross would be no exception. The question my girlfriend and I ask ourselves when an item such as this goes missing is, what the heck is going on? I mean, we're talking about a sizable cross here. 6 inches long, 4 inches wide. It's not something you just misplace. How could we? We had nailed it above our bed, on the wall, and now it's gone. No use looking for it. Only 2 people are living in the house, my girlfriend and I. Fast forward to the premiere of the Captain America movie. It's Saturday morning. The cross has been missing for over a week now. I began doing my laundry early that day, earlier than usual. I figured it's best to get my chores done if I'm to go out to a movie later. I'm excited. I'm going to see the Marvel movie with one of my best friends. Let me get this laundry done ASAP. I began my first load of laundry, colored clothing. My girlfriend Tina, she's walking around the house doing her own thing. I decided to go to my office and watch TV, wait for my clothes to wash. About an hour later, I noticed something peculiar. My first load of clothing was still washing. Now I know there are long wash cycles, but this was weird. My brain knows how long it takes for my clothes to wash. I'm pretty sure I didn't set the washing machine to the long cycle. It's taking especially long this time. And that's unusual. I glanced toward the washroom, hoping to hear the beep. You know, the noise the washing machine makes when it's done. So I glance at the washroom and I look at the clock on my computer. I think to myself, what's taking my clothes so long to wash? A few minutes later, I hear this knocking sound. You know, the sound the washing machine or the dryer makes when something big is inside, like a shoe or something. The noise I'm hearing is coming from the washing machine. Once again, I glance up from my PC and look at the washroom. What could be making that noise, I wonder? At this point, the wash cycle had been running for nearly an hour, far too long for what I put inside. Normally, I would get up and see what the commotion was about. I didn't this time. I just kept watching TV. Finally, the washing machine beeps, informing me that the load was complete. Time to remove the clothing. I'm passive as passive can be. No hurry whatsoever as I was pulling out my clothes and tossing them into the dryer. I immediately grab hold of something solid. Not clothing, not shoes, not anything except a metallic wooden cross. I didn't know what it was until I pulled it out of the washing machine. And then there, in my hand, in 2 pieces, is the cross my cousin gave me. Now some might say, well, maybe the cross was in there to begin with. Not so. As I mentioned prior, it would have been heard early on. The thumping noise, I mean. The knocking noise. I heard it, and it began 15 minutes before the washing was complete. Secondly, the washing machine was empty when I used it. Some might say, maybe you accidentally put the cross in the washing machine when you loaded it with clothes. Wrong again. I sorted my clothing carefully, meaning items went into the machine almost one at a time. A cross this size was not going to be grabbed by mistake. Even if it was, I would have heard the bumping noise way sooner than I did. Maybe your girlfriend put it in by mistake. No, my girlfriend was nowhere near the washing machine that day, and I never left my office. The washroom sits right outside my office. She wouldn't stop my wash load regardless. I do my laundry, she does hers. It's important I get those particulars out of the way for fear of people gravitating towards the obvious explanation, and that's understandable. But now, allow me to paint the picture as near perfect as possible, because it hasn't even begun to get weird yet. But in my hand is the cross my cousin gave me. It took a sort of beating in the washing machine. It's broken up now. I then call my girlfriend to the room. We both examine the cross, top to bottom. Here it is again, after being gone for about a week. This cross would disappear and get thrown a few more times before finally being left alone. The Bothell Hell House poster fire. Spring 2014. Not that many poltergeist survivors can say they witnessed seeing a poltergeist flee the scene of a crime. By crime, I mean arson. But I can. One of the most horrifying events I faced while living in the Bothell home was the day the poster caught fire in my office. Recap. Tina and I had witnessed a lot of activity in the weeks leading up to the poster catching fire. I'm talking about bar stools being thrown. Our bedroom light was going on and off by itself in the middle of our sleeping. Loud bangs, loud footsteps, door slams. And yes, one Bible catching fire. All of that happened within a week of the story I'm about to tell. The advice given to us by friends and family was to smudge the house. The internet said the same thing. Smudging lessens the activity. Let me tell you, smudging never lessened the activity. Not in our house. It made it worse. This story is proof of that. The night before the poster caught fire, I asked Tina if she would feel comfortable smudging the house. Tina was an excellent person to do the smudging. She was more thorough than me. She could smudge every nook and cranny. And so she did. The next day we woke up and got ourselves ready for work. Nothing unusual about that morning, except the house was still smelling like burnt sage, which I thought was a good thing. Your house should smell like sage if you smudged the night before. I later found out that smudging before you go to bed can be dangerous. Extremely dangerous. I compare smudging before going to bed to kicking open a fire ant bed before having a picnic. Tina and I got up that morning and did what we always do. We got ready for work. The feeling of being watched had lessened. 30-odd minutes later of us waking up, Tina walks up to me and kisses me goodbye. Now it's just me in the house. The only thing on my mind right now is beating Seattle traffic. I gotta get out of this house and get to work. A few minutes after I stepped into the shower, it happened. The devil arrived. Every fire alarm in the house starts going off. I'm standing in the doorway of the bathroom, half dried off, thinking, oh shit, it's happening. I knew right then that something was up. I didn't know what specifically, not yet anyway. Something is up, though, and it's not good. I remember running through the master bedroom and reaching our bedroom doorway, and that's when I saw it. Well, felt it. I feel a large mass run right by me. I can't see what runs past me. I can only feel it. It was huge, taller than me, wider than me. All I could hear besides the fire alarms going off was this loud stomping sound. My eyes and ears turned toward the direction of the stomping noise and followed it downstairs. Suddenly, the front door of the house opens wide and is slammed shut. That is it. The door just opens wide on its own and slams shut. That's when my brain says, "Give chase, Keith. Give chase." But I'm thinking, give chase to what? I still have not determined if someone was in the house. I haven't seen anything. The door just opened and closed on its own. What am I chasing? So I do what my brain says. I run down the stairs and I reach the front door. I should be able to get a good glimpse of the intruder as he's leaving the house. I throw my hand on the doorknob and nothing happens. The front door does not open. Correction, the front door does not budge, not even a centimeter. I must have fought with the doorknob for about 2 seconds before realizing that I had a fire to deal with. Smoke is billowing from my office upstairs. I run to my office and there it is, ladies and gentlemen. There's the fire. The wall behind my computer desk is on fire. The poster, specifically. How many seconds have transpired between the fire alarm going off and where I'm standing now? 30 seconds. The first thing I do to kill the fire is toss my damp towel over it. The fire did not put up a fight. It was gone. I turn and I run downstairs again. The house is filled with smoke. I get to the front door and I try to open the front door again. Nothing. The door will not budge. This is the same door I saw open less than a minute ago. The doorway felt like it had been welded shut. The fire alarms are still wailing in the background. I can taste the chemicals from my burnt poster in my mouth, the smell in my nostrils. And that's when it dawned on me. The house isn't the one that's under attack. I am. Think carefully, Keith. The next few decisions could be your last. What are you gonna do? I was in shock at this stage because I remember the events vaguely at this point. Suddenly, I'm on the phone with the 911 operator. I'm screaming to her that my house is on fire. She's maintaining her level of professionalism, asking me in a calm voice,
"What's your address?"
Every time I utter my address through the phone, enormous amounts of static breaks out. I'm talking about loud electrical interference. We go through this, "I can't hear you."
"Can you repeat your address?"
routine for about 30 seconds. Finally, she gets my address, and in doing so, she lets me know the fire department is on their way. I hang up and call Tina. Thank God she answers. Tina could hear the fire alarm screaming through the phone. I blurt out for her to come back home, to come back to the house. The house is under attack. I hang up. The front door, for reasons I can't explain, finally opened. It opened within seconds of the fire department arriving. How ironic. The firemen dart inside, and at my urging, proceed up towards the office. They said I did a good job of putting the poster fire out. Tina runs into the house a minute after they arrived and grabs me. I was half naked and shaking like a leaf because all I could remember was Tina throwing blankets over me. I'm shivering and shaking like a wet puppy. I'm not afraid to admit that I was crying and quivering like a baby. You would have thought somebody doused me in a tub of ice water, cubes and all. That's how cold I was. The fire department never could determine what caused the fire. Tina and I knew, though. This is the second fire incident that we've experienced. Note, There will be 2 more fire incidents in that house in the coming weeks. When the fire department left, all Tina and I had now was each other. The demons who did this are still here. They're snickering at us. Whatever ran past me in the upstairs hallway had to have been some sort of ringleader. I'll always remember what it felt like when it ran past me, through me. Evil, diabolical evil. Neither one of us could think of a solution to our problem. The only thing left to do now is to contact the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church that, up to this point, has been ignoring us, giving us the runaround. It's the only logical thing to do now, right? Who else can help us? Tina and I looked at each other and we had reached the same conclusion. So, we're marching down to the local parish office, and we're not leaving until someone sees us. Kind of a scary thing going on. My girlfriend, 25, of about 3 years now, who I met after she was in recovery, had just rebuilt her life when we met. We've had plenty of ups and downs, but we love each other. Anyway, when she was living with me, on 2 or 3 occasions, she had mentioned about a year or more ago that she was being followed by black SUVs. They were black GNC vans with tints. Fast forward to this morning, the same van was driving towards her, on her way to the train, and the driver rolled down the passenger window and says, "I'm so happy we finally found you, Miss," and then her last name. She kept walking and crossed the street where the van wouldn't be able to get next to her. She called me and was in tears after she ran to the train station once she was out of sight of the van. We're not sure what's going on here. She claims that her ex is a single male, raising multiple kids that aren't his. They're all girls under 17. He also sold drugs and knew big-time guys who trafficked drugs. She said this to me on WhatsApp after she got mad that I kept asking why anybody would be following her. She also claims that they've asked if she could move things across the border, which she claims she never did. She also snuck in the fact that the drugs sold by either her ex or his friends have killed people in the past. But that was 4 or 5 years ago. The only other thing that I could think of is she claims she was abducted by aliens as a kid, but that's kind of crazy to me, and I've always dismissed it in my head as bad dreams that she had as a child. But they wouldn't come back in an SUV if they wanted to talk to her. She's always very level-headed and honest about everything, and there's no reason she would make any of this up or lie to me. And she was in tears on the phone. She's leaving work at a weird time today to pick me up when my shift is over, which she would never do unless she felt unsafe, like she does now. My theory, she moved into a new apartment and her address was changed on the registry within the last 3 or so months. It's a very upscale place as her job pays her very well and she holds a supervisor position. She also financed a nice car about a year ago. I think that maybe she dropped off the map and appeared at an expensive residence with a nice car, and now they're asking questions. I'm not sure what I would rather it be at this point. Nobody's going to pop out of a black-tinted van with good news. It's not like they're following her because she has an unclaimed lottery ticket or something. Any advice is appreciated, as this is kind of freaking me out, and I'm really trying to stay cool about the situation. This all happened exactly a year ago. Shout out to Facebook Memories for reminding me. I lived in a ground floor apartment in a heavy foot traffic area. It used to be a corner storefront, so the living room windows were huge and only one small one could be opened. I had a very violent upstairs neighbor, and even angrier dealers living across the street. I've had to make multiple calls to the police and give statements. Aside from them, the neighborhood was pretty lovely, and I got along well with all of my sane neighbors. One of my cats even became a local celebrity, thanks to a haunted Halloween tour that would make a stop at my corner every night. They would tell stories, and the second he heard them, he'd sprint from wherever he was to jump up on the windowsill and listen while they all cooed at him. Anyway, because of the large windows, I didn't have any privacy in my living room. Usually I didn't mind this because I'm a people watcher, and my cats also loved the view. I had blinds and sheer curtains, but you could always see straight into my apartment. Thankfully, I had plenty of privacy in my bathroom and bedroom. One night, I was sitting at my computer desk in the living room, just watching YouTube and sipping on a beer. I heard a group of people talking outside, but these were normal sounds for the area and would have ignored it completely if I didn't hear one of them speaking directly into the window fan in the one open window.
Oh, she's drinking a beer. Doesn't she usually drink whiskey?
I spun around in my chair instantly, and then I heard,
"Oh shit, she saw us,"
and scuffling as they ran away. I could not see them because it was dark outside, but it sounded like there were at least 2 women and 2 men. I was frozen in place just listening for anything else, like footsteps or their voices again. It took me a while to fully realize what I'd just heard. I do typically prefer to sip on whiskey at night, but that day I wanted to try a new beer flavor I saw at the store. These people knew my habits well enough to know this. I was also deeply concerned that they knew it was whiskey, since I'd drink it out of a set of patterned glasses. There was no way to tell what was in them. You could see the kitchen from the living room window, but I often kept my whiskey in the freezer, so they'd have to see me at a specific moment to know. Needless to say, I didn't sleep that night. And while I couldn't sleep, I remembered another incident that had happened a few nights prior. I keep my bedroom window open at night because I sleep right under it, and I like the night breezes. There's a bright security light directly across the street, so even with the blinds down, I still have quite a bit of light hitting the opposite wall. One night, I woke up around 3 or 4 a.m., which isn't unusual for me, and I just turned on a Netflix movie to fall back asleep. While laying there, I see the shadow of a head and shoulders appearing on the wall, and it just stays there for way too long. I'd guess 15-20 minutes. Now, this isn't very common, but people have stopped to smoke a cigarette right outside my window before. The smell gives me an instant headache, but this time, there was no smoke or smell of any kind. Someone was just standing there. I couldn't tell which way they were facing, but after the recent event, I wondered if someone was looking in while they thought I was sleeping. I told my coworkers about these events, and they were terrified for me. I was actually planning on moving at the end of October and just slowly bringing boxes and furniture to my new place over the course of the month. Once they heard what happened, they all banded together and got 75% of my things over in one day. I told them all I cared about was my animals and my bed, but they got everything except the larger furniture and whatever we couldn't box up and move before midnight. I love them all very much and appreciate them every single day. I had a couple of anxiety attacks over this, especially when I had to go back for the last of my stuff. But I felt completely safe in my new place. I also got a full-blown security system with sensors and cameras. Unfortunately, this wasn't the first and ended up not being the last time I was watched or stalked. I still visit the area of my old apartment from time to time because it's a great bar scene. I don't think I'd be able to pick out their voices, but no one's given me any weird looks or vibes since. I was watching Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer series at home, and I felt sick to my stomach. This was around midnight. Then, a few minutes went by and I felt like going to 7-Eleven to grab a hot chocolate. As I drove and parked my car in the parking lot, I saw a creepy blonde-haired guy who looked to be around 30, 5'8", standing right in front of the door. I was worried, but brushed it off. I then tried entering from the side, going inside the 7-Eleven, but the tall guy was just blocking the door. At this point, I didn't care about his looks or how attractive he seemed to be because I thought in my head, that's how psychos look. They look charming and have bad intentions or motives. However, stupidly, I said in a pleasing voice, "I'm sorry," and nudged him to move. He just smiled in a weird way and said,
I'll be waiting outside.
I just got my stuff, and as I ran to my car, even though I have asthma and it was hard, I didn't want to take any risks of being killed, so I ran. As I ran, he kept saying,
Hey, I'm a good man, I swear to God. Why are you running now?
The guy was heading to my car in such a slow pace, left hand in one pocket, and the right hand gestured and made a shh sound to his lips. He was 3 feet away, and then came up quickly and was about to open my door. I quickly locked it before he came close, and then I showed him my middle finger. He tried opening the fucking door and was banging on the window. I sped off like a maniac. I was shaking, literally, and was about to cry, but I didn't want to seem weak, and I headed to the highway. He was following me, fast, and I quickly went someplace else, exited the highway faster. This was the decision when I felt threatened. I should have went somewhere else. I should have not drove a higher speed limit over the highway, or I could have been stopped. Why the fuck didn't I think of that? Fuck. I did call the cops and gave all the info about this man, and then I drove further away. Then I went to a populated place, the mall, parked my car in the parking lot. I ran into the mall. I stayed sitting on a bench. After an hour had passed by, I looked around carefully, and I didn't see him. I think I accidentally manifested something evil while watching the series, without knowing or manifesting it later. I'm not watching creepy, gruesome killer stuff anymore. I'm scared and paranoid. After that, I told my older sister about it. She told me I'm delusional or hallucinating ever since I saw the series. I've been feeling so much anxiety about it. This happened a few nights ago, or I guess even a week ago now. I can't go to my favorite gas station at night anymore, and I basically avoid it in the day too. I mean, it already started getting sketchy about 6 months ago, but now it's just out of control. Before I get into this, please know I'm not judging people who struggle with addiction in general, but at the same time, I am about to pass judgment on somebody who is very likely on drugs. If that offends you, just remember, they're not the ones who walked away with scratches. I usually hit up this gas station every night after my shift. I'm a bartender who works down at the waterfront, and my last shift ends around 11:30. I get to this place a bit before midnight. I grab my drinks, my jewels, maybe some Skittles, and then I'm out. Well, about a week ago, it didn't go half as smooth. I got in okay, grabbed my goods, though no Skittles this time, just a blue Powerade and my jewels. It was getting out of there that gave me trouble. I never even saw anyone near the store, not when I had pulled up. But heading out to my car, I see tucked on the side of the building are 2 or 3 guys smoking. I don't know what they're smoking, it's none of my business, so whatever. I I fiddle for my keys, and I hear someone right up in my space speak into my left ear. They're close as fuck to my face, and I'm frozen for a split second before I whip around, asking what the fuck is going on and telling them to back up. It registers with me that the guy said, "You smoke dope?" To which I'm answering him now, "I don't smoke dope. Now back up." I realize that he doesn't look armed and his hands aren't in his pockets, so I feel comfortable continuing to open my car door to get the fuck out of there. Then, a hand slams my door shut as I barely get it opening. His angry, sluggish voice lets out a sharp, "Bitch," followed by one of those weird-ass, loud whistles. I see the 3 or so guys on the side start to make their way over to where I'm standing. Before they even take a few steps, I'm whipping around to push the man away from me. He barely moves, his hand only lifting off the car for a moment, but I'm running out of time before these 3 dudes surround my car. Before I can swing on him with my bag of goods, he presses my shoulder against the car, and it wasn't a gentle nudge either. It's funny though, I didn't think to scream. I had this moment where I thought, no one's going to give a fuck if I start screaming. I knew that the man that worked at the gas station at this time was so old, like barely hanging on for life, and man couldn't hear shit. The only other people around at the time are the group of men I'm trying to avoid. I go to knee him in the balls, and like some sort of Matrix junkie, he swings his hips backwards, causing my knee to miss his junk. But he's pissed and almost distracted, enough to where I was able to smack his arm away and grab my car door handle, unpin my shoulder. I'm now trying to put the bag of goods between me and this fucker. I open the door slightly, and while part of me wants to reach my arm through the small crack that's open, I don't want this man to push me or the door, suddenly crushing my hand or worse. But doing nothing causes the man to grab my free arm, gripping it hard with his dirty hand, fingernails digging into my forearm, and for the first time I yelled out. As I'm screaming for the guy to let the fuck go, 2 other guys attempt to open the passenger side door. I say fuck it, and I use all my strength with my other arm to pry the door open, kicking the man's leg to push him away. Then, the 3rd man of the group joins this guy, grabbing my arm. I use my foot to kick him in the balls. I make contact and he falls. He loosens the grip, and it causes the man to loosen slightly, and I take that chance to remove my arm. I can't get it entirely free, but I've gotten the door open. I've launched myself into the driver's seat, and I keep pulling, but he hasn't fully let go. I grab my steering wheel for leverage, and I pull. With one painful yank, I feel the man's nails dig and scrape into my skin as I pull. And then, I'm free. He quickly tried to put his hand back in to grab anything, but I quickly slammed the door on his hand, opening it only slightly for him to remove it. Now, all of the men were on the driver's side, but I've got all of the doors locked. I practically was crying the whole way out of the parking lot and home, but I wasn't going to go home. These were angry tears. I was so fucking pissed that these guys had scared me away from my favorite gas station, that it was almost so much worse, that I had these fucking disgusting scratches on my arm to remind me of this for God knows how long. Before going home, I drove to the police station to file a proper report. I had them take photos of my arm. I explained what happened, when and where, but I also described each of the men in detail. I told the police I didn't want to stick around to see if they were there still, but I urged them to keep an eye on that gas station and an eye out for these men. Truthfully, I have no idea what their intentions were. All I know is that when someone puts their hands on you, invades your space, and has like power in numbers. That shit's terrifying. I still drive by occasionally, sometimes before work, sometimes after. It may not be those guys, not all of them anyway, but the place isn't looking too safe these days. The side of the building is sketchy, and it's sad. I filed a report because if any other woman or human has to experience that shit, I'm gonna know that it's because the police failed them. Someone who could do something about it failed them, not me. My grandma and her family used to live in a small area in Tennessee. Her parents, siblings, and she moved into an old farmhouse in the 50s. I asked her how old she thought the house was, like a specific date, but she said she didn't know, that it was definitely old. At night, they would hear doors open and shut in the house, all night long, and the sound of a cat screeching. Finally, her daddy had had enough and removed the hinges and replaced them with leather hinges to see if that would stop the door from opening and shutting. It didn't. It still kept doing it, opening, shutting, and the sound of a cat screeching. Also, under this house was enough room for her and her siblings to play underneath. The house was set up high on stones. There was no skirting under the home. It was just open. Someone had tried to build a cellar to connect to the home, but never finished it. On the ground, every day that they went down there, they would find balls of long hair. It looked gray and like women's hair. And underneath the hair was coins or change. They would just toss the hair and grab the coins. Again, no explanation for this. One day, Grandma's mom got sick, so great-great-grandma, which was Grandma's mom's mother, came over to help with the kids and help her daughter. Interesting side fact was that great-great-grandma was Cherokee, but she would never ever admit to it. I asked. She would always claim Black Dutch. She was terrified of being taken to Oklahoma, to a reservation. Anyway, great-great-grandma only stayed one night and got ready to leave before the sun came up. Grandma said her mama asked why she was leaving, to which she replied, "I seen a man and his wife pass through the dresser and into the wall. The wife was missing her head. I ain't staying in this house." She left and never came back to that house. Across the road, and across from the house where they lived, was an open field. In the field was a large 3-story home, a rancher-type house. In its heyday, it must have been beautiful, but now it looked weathered. The paint was peeling, and it looked like it had seen better days. Every night, on the top floor in one of the windows, everyone saw a candlelight flickering. Grandma's dad was curious, and one day, during sunlight of course, he walked over to the old house to see where the light could be coming from, and if anyone was living there. The kids came along. Great-grandpa walked inside. The house on the inside looked worse, and there was no way that someone could go up the stairs to the top floor because the stairs had rotted away. Meanwhile, Grandma's half-sister went to the cellar door of the old house and opened it. Down in the cellar was an old, tacky-looking man. He looked up and he said to her,
"Come on in."
Her sister slammed the door and ran. There were no steps that led into the cellar. I don't think they ever went back over to that rancher house again. They stayed in their house from when my grandma was 8 till she was 11, and the family moved. This occurred when I was around 10 years old. I grew up in a small town, and I lived in a 3-bedroom, 1,500 square foot house with 6 people. This meant my sisters and I shared a small room. My grandma decided that she was tired of having no space in our room with the 3 single beds, and it was time to get a bunk bed. In this small town, I remember shopping for this bunk bed in this run-down store. It wasn't the typical furniture store. I almost believed that it was a second-hand shop or some type of discount store. By the time I was in my teens, this building was turned into a billiard game room. This place wasn't there long. The exciting day arrived. We put the bunk beds in the room, moved the dresser with a small black and white old TV and an Atari. These weren't new, but moved from another location in the house. This was the late 80s. Yes, we had an Atari, when everybody else had a Nintendo or a Super Nintendo. The Atari and TV were placed so that I could sit on the end of the single bed and use it as a chair while we played Atari. The space between the single bed and bunk bed was approximately 2 to 3 feet. This is when the paranormal activity in our room started to become frequent. I had opted to take the single bed since my sisters really wanted to sleep in a cool bunk bed. They have more stories than myself. Anyway, one night, I remember being in my room alone, playing on the Atari. My grandma and mom were talking to some family members that had stopped by, and my sisters were watching TV in the family room. Again, small house, small room. I know I was alone in the room. Being alone and being alone with the Atari was something that didn't happen often. I was focused on my game when to the right, I could hear the bunk bed shake a little, like someone just grabbed it and shook it for a second. That had to be my imagination, right? A few seconds or more go by, and the thing shakes again. This time for a few seconds. I remember distinctively telling myself, "Don't be afraid. Don't look. Don't be afraid. It's nothing." Almost to a new high score, and if I die, I don't have to give anyone else a turn. Motivation to stay. A few more seconds go by as I keep playing my game. It shakes a 3rd time, for what I remember being the same interval as the last. Again, I tell myself to be strong, don't be afraid. It's just your imagination. Don't even look. Well, with whatever was happening, I must have pissed it off with my lack of response or acknowledgement. The bunk bed began violently shaking with no stopping. I stood up and I ran, dropping the Atari paddle and hearing it swing into the dresser. I didn't get to beat my high score. My grandma and my mom didn't believe me. I was laughed at by the visiting family members. At least I didn't have to sleep in that bunk bed or go back into that room by myself. My sisters have some more scary stories, like an old man ghost standing on the end of the bed, climbing the ladder with glowing white hair. One was hearing glass shatter in the room and not being able to find the source. Quite a few more, but that was my personal scary story with it. We ended up having a house fire due to a malfunctioning AC unit 4 years later, and it destroyed that bed. After restoring the house and damages, my twin and I ended up moving back into that room with 2 single beds. The air in that room felt lighter and more free. Never had a haunting or paranormal experience in that room after that. Hence, we dubbed it the haunted bunk bed. My little sister's been drawing progressively more and more violent pictures in her notebook. She's 5, and yesterday her kindergarten teacher had a meeting with our mom after school when we came to pick her up. I waited in the car with my sister while they spoke in the classroom. I knew it was bad because windows to the kindergarten room faced the front courtyard parking lot. My mom and the teacher both glancing out the window at the Jeep that we're sitting in, their expressions dressed with looks of concern. When my mom returns to the car, she's carrying a handful of papers that my sister Jaden's covered in some pretty horrific imagery using her crayons. Pictures of houses with people burning inside, families hanging in trees, and this tall, dark scribble with red eyes floating above a bed while a girl is crying in it. I flipped through the pages again. I noticed the black scribble was hidden everywhere in each of the drawings that Jaden had made. Sitting in the kitchen of the firehouse, I originally didn't notice it until I saw the red eyes, which I'd thought was smoke originally. The next picture, it's crouched in the branches above the hanging family. I turned to ask what these scary drawings were about, but my mom stopped me, advising to wait until we got home. The rest of the trip home, Jaden danced to Kids Bop, and I couldn't help but stare at the art that she'd created. Crayon marks with raised edges of crushed wax, a result of how hard she was pressing while drawing these vile depictions. When the Jeep pulls to a stop in our driveway, Jaden jumps out and runs inside the house, giving my mom a chance to briefly tell me what the kindergarten teacher had told her. At recess, earlier that day, Jaden fell to the ground and started convulsing. When the patrol staff saw her, they ran over, and Jaden instantly got back up to her feet, saying,
Gotcha.
then laughing and running off. It really scared the elderly woman who first saw Jaden bouncing and squirming on the ground. I asked my mom if she saw that Jaden had drawn a red-eyed black scribble person in every picture. She said yes, her teacher did too. Although this doesn't need mentioning from an emotional perspective because we love Jaden like she is our real family, but she is in fact my stepfather Jeff's daughter from a previous marriage. My mom and Jeff got married when she was in her terrible twos. Jaden was actually relatively decent as a toddler, though. She always used to be a good kid, and that's why this recent spike in behavior has been quite unsettling to the rest of the family. That weekend, Jeff managed to get Jaden a Zoom appointment with a therapist. After Jaden got off the call, the therapist stayed on a little longer with Jeff and my mom. I sit off screen and I listen as they discuss the conversation. The therapist tells them Jaden mentioned the red-eyed entity during their time together. Jaden's named it Mr. Red. She says it shows her how she died in past lives. Her pictures are from the images that are shown in her head. Jaden explained it as a movie behind her eyes. The therapist asked if Jeff or my mom know where she could be getting these inspirations from. They both shake their heads. Jeff and my mom are two of the most laid-back individuals you'd ever meet. Our house isn't filled with chaos and no routines have drastically changed. The therapist concludes by scheduling another follow-up later the next week and asks us to continue observing her behavior, writing down anything out of the ordinary. Later that night, after dinner, while Jeff and my mom are outside smoking cigarettes, I go into Jaden's room and I ask about Mr. Red. I'm not one to beat around the bush. The fastest way to find something out is simply by asking. So I asked, "Who's Mr. Red?" As if common knowledge, Jaden tells me Mr. Red's an angel and that they had met in her before life. She says Mr. Red brought her to her now mom, Latrish. Jaden was familiar with his presence and spoke of Mr. Red like referencing a friend from school who'd been absent. She then says she hadn't seen Mr. Red since being Jaden. I ask how recent was his last visit. She says at school today. Jaden says that she thinks she fell because Mr. Red was picking her up off the ground, telling her to go have fun. She doesn't remember telling the recess teacher, "Gotcha." Trying not to scare her, I act casual while she tells me all of this, which I then relay to Jeff and my mom the moment I exit Jaden's room. My mom wrote it all down for the therapist. Their appointment's scheduled for next Wednesday at 3. But I don't think my anxiety can wait that long for a theory as to what my sister's doing. Could this just be a wild attempt at getting attention? Are there any other questions I should be asking her? Parents or older siblings, is this just what kindergartners do? My father wasn't faithful. He was a man of faith, but hardly practiced what he preached. One night, he came home late from work, smelling like another poor sucker of a woman's perfume. Then, he had the nerve to lay his hands on my mom when she mentioned the pungent aroma that he'd brought in. He popped her in the eye, and it swelled up real fast. I ran at him, swinging with everything I had, trying to stop him from going after my mom, but he was a behemoth compared to my small stature at the time. Before I can get in striking distance, he turns and punches me in the stomach, instantly knocking the wind out of my entire body, crumbling me to the floor. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. My mom ran into the bedroom and got his hunting rifle from the closet. She didn't know a lot about guns, but knew enough to aim and shoot one. My mom also didn't have to worry about aiming it all that much, seeing as she fired from a near point-blank range, lining the barrel up right under the back snaps of his hat before pulling the trigger. Recoil kicked the rifle up and out of her hands, bouncing off the ceiling at the exact same time his hat did. We left his body in the living room until the next day. Early in the afternoon, my mom thinks, his work will be suspicious if he no-call no-shows. She calls his boss, fabricating a lie about a foodborne illness that her husband's come down with, explaining this is why he's been unaccounted for. His boss tells her that Jeremy, my dad, was let go back in August. They hang up, and I can't help but to question my mom about her poor choice in men. Jeremy was never a good father or husband, but for some reason, my mom had built a life and a family with this man over 10 years ago, before that night. Years of abuse, physical and mental, walking on eggshells every night, in fear something we'd do would set him off. We both felt a sense of morbid relief when the rifle's boom silenced his degrading tirade. My mom took the whole next day digging a hole in the outskirts of our property. It's where she buried my dad. I stayed at my grandma's house while she deep cleaned the living room and every item of clothing we wore that night. Jeremy's car was pushed deep into the lake off the interstate. My mom then walked the 12 miles back home in the dark. But even in death, his torment persisted. My mom would see his shadow standing in doorways or walking from room to room. I remember one morning when I walked into her room, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the door. Quickly, she asked me if I was just in her room, but I wasn't. Before walking in, I'd been in my room, sleeping. Sometimes, she would wake up screaming, even crying out, usually something like no or stop. Often, loud enough to wake me up 2 doors down. I couldn't believe that it was possible to be tormented even after death. You think the worst is over, that the bad is gone, until it's sharing some sort of realm with you, still. From time to time, I'd catch him in the corner of my eye, always with more detail than I would like. I'd spot his red flannel standing out against the other more gray spatial colors. Of course, it was his red flannel, accompanied by a radiating dark feeling of dread, walking on eggshells, only I knew now that it was only a feeling. I hated it. I resented it. I resented the whole house, probably, my life in general, but I was too young to understand that. I would usually ignore him entirely. I wouldn't try to make eye contact or engage. I only talked to him once. I knew he'd been scaring my cat, Smithers. He liked to sleep between my mom's room and my room, which is why we keep the doors open. At night, my dad, he'd close the door, and he'd stand in my mom's doorway, a towering dark figure in the night. Smithers, horrified. For several days, I found him sleeping in the bathtub in the bathroom next to my room. So, I'd been really actually pissed off. Laying in bed, I shouted, not caring if my mom heard me or not. I yelled that I hated him, to leave me the fuck alone. I told him to stop scaring my cat, that he was a dead guy. He needed to move on. After that outburst, I felt pretty good. I was young, but proud of myself for swearing, for standing up to the guy, even if he was dead. From there on out, I spent my time avoiding his energy, focusing on mine. Whether I could or not, it doesn't really matter. I believed I could control my experiences. My mom, not so much. This happened for 2 months, until my mom couldn't take it anymore. She called the police to dig up the body. I then spent the rest of my adolescence up north with my aunt and uncle. I often wonder what happened to that property, and if his spirit, or whatever you call it, is still roaming. Of course, I can't personally bring myself to go back there. I mean, I escaped the guy twice now. I'm not gonna risk it. There's a bit of a backstory, but it's important. In February 2015, my sister ended up buying a Ouija board. She bought it from Spencer's Gifts, so it was cheap and plastic. It had a moon and a sun in the top corners, 2 images on the bottom that I really don't remember. She made plans with 2 of her friends, S and D, and myself, to use the board. My mother is a Bible thumper, so we couldn't do it in our house, and we decided to go to S's house, since her parents are open to things like that. We all spent the night at S's house. They wanted to wait to take out the board until 12 a.m., the witching hour, to have a higher chance of making contact with something, I guess. We had a dance party, and we ate a ton of junk food. At about 10:30, we settled down to watch a movie. I fell asleep. At about 11:45 p.m., S stopped the movie, and we started setting up. I was tired from our craziness. We shut off the lights, lit white candles, and got around the board. My sister, S, and I had our hands on the planchette, while D sat next to us with a piece of paper and a pencil to document. She was too scared to use the board. We opened the board and we asked questions, without much luck. We stopped and we talked about what we could do to help move things along. After a while, my sister looked up an app on her phone that would take words that ghosts were saying, or something like that. S thought that it was stupid, but We were going to try anything. The phone was handed off to Dee to keep an eye on it. We kept talking about how the candles were too bright or someone wasn't open enough to it. And Dee said that the phone just said plastic and bored, one after the other. We took that as a sign that something may be happening. The moment I put my fingers on the planchette, I started shaking. Dread washed over me so intensely, but I couldn't let go of the planchette. I didn't want to. It took all I had to keep myself from crying. The board started off silent, but all of a sudden it moved to Z, and then Y, and then X. My sister instantly got scared and said, "Move it to goodbye, now." We did, and the feeling was gone as quickly as it came. My sister explained that if whatever is moving the planchette starts counting down, moving up or down in the alphabet, making figure eights, or moving to the four corners, it's a bad spirit or a demon trying to make the board a portal. We stopped for the night after that. I didn't tell them how I felt. I was worried that they would just think that I was messing with them, that they wouldn't believe me. I had trouble sleeping because I thought that it would come back as I slept. I'd never experienced dread quite like that before. It felt violating. It felt like whatever it was tried to possess my body. I feel that because I was so tired, I was vulnerable to the attack. I'll never play with the board again. It's not a game. It's so real, and it can go very wrong. This story takes place around 2010-2011, when I was in high school. At this age, I was not the sharpest tool in the shed, with no real discernment or understanding of the spiritual world. At that time, I had a weird obsession with anything occult or satanic. Just to clarify, I'm now 27 and a firm believer and follower of Jesus Christ. And I realize how insane I was to open a door for something evil to enter my home, my life. I experimented with a crudely home-constructed Ouija board a few times and experienced some weird occurrences. It all started when one afternoon, a few friends and I headed to my house for our almost daily after-school smoking session, which always took place in the detached garage. This is also where we had attempted to contact something with the aforementioned Ouija board. We succeeded, and when we asked the entity its name, the planchette moved and spelled out, Keith. Keith answered all of our questions, explaining that he died in 1990 and that his favorite band was Nirvana. I can't really remember anything else that was exchanged. But I awoke the next morning to scratch marks on my side, and though they were only superficial, my stomach dropped when I examined it closer. The scratches were all placed methodically to form a perfect drawing, if you will, of the Nirvana logo. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, it's a smiley face with X's for eyes and a squiggly mouth with its tongue sticking out. My friends came over to my house again the next day, and we confronted Keith, asking if he'd been the one to do this. I already knew, but it was confirmed when the planchette moved to yes. Sometime after this, during summer break, I had a group of about 7 people over for a bonfire in the backyard. One of these friends lived in another city, and they were staying at my house for a week. We'll call her April. It was dark, and still, not even a slight breeze could be felt that night. The friends which had been present for the Keith sessions and I had been talking to the rest about what we'd experienced, and we all agreed to try the board, see if it would happen again. I can't remember exactly what was said, or if the planchette was responding. But what I do remember was asking if whatever I was addressing hated me. Instantly, the planchette flew over yes, and a huge gust of wind started blowing all around me. Just me. It was like a dust devil had formed and enclosed me like a cocoon, as dust and leaves and debris violently flew over me and at me in every direction. I looked at my friends as they were watching this occur, and I swear to you, not one hair on their heads moved. When it stopped, we immediately moved the planchette to goodbye and just kind of sat there in shock for a while. After everyone else left, April and I headed inside, as it was very late. Then, I took the most uncomfortable shower of my life. You know how, when someone is standing near or enters the room, you can just feel their presence? Well, that feeling hung in the air, like a thick cloud. Just the feeling of someone straight up watching me. Now, I'm notorious for taking long showers, using up all the hot water, but I got out of there in what felt like 3 minutes. The next part, it requires a bit of a layout of the house. When you enter, there's a family room with a single large window facing the front yard, a couch in front of said window, and a TV. From this room, going right, you'd go down an L-shaped hallway, with my room on the immediate right, and a bathroom, my brother's, and my parents' room down the hall. And left, you'd be in the kitchen, which led to what my dad had dubbed the music room, since we kept all of our instruments and sound equipment in there. It also functioned as a second living room. It too contained a couch and TV, separating this room from the kitchen with a glass door. April and I were sitting at the kitchen table, chatting. She was sitting on one side, her back facing the music room, and I sat on the other, facing her. As she was speaking, I noticed movement behind her. I looked, and I watched in shock as the glass door, which had been slightly ajar, was slowly opening. I should mention that there were no windows open in the house, no draft. The air conditioning was not running at the time, and my parents and brother were fast asleep. "April," I said in a hushed but panicked tone as I pointed to the door. She turned and saw it too, looking back at me for a split second in horror. When the door had completely opened, everything was still and silent for about 3 seconds. Then, the door suddenly and forcefully slammed shut. Needless to say, we were freaked the hell out and retreated to my room. After we'd calmed ourselves down, we tried in vain to sleep, as throughout the night, we could hear what sounded like scratching coming from inside my closet. I've always dealt with insomnia, and I'd often have to sleep in the family room, as the TV was the only thing that could make me drowsy. I'd always put on a sleep timer, so the TV wouldn't be on all night after I fell asleep. April had gone home at this point, and I was in a deep sleep on the couch when I abruptly awoke in a cold sweat. The TV was off, so I could see the window behind me in the screen's reflection. There was some light seeping through the curtains from the back streetlight outside, and I could clearly see standing behind me a large black figure whose shoulders touched the ceiling, and its head bent down slightly, staring at me. I quickly covered my face with the blanket, seriously hoping this thing didn't know I was awake or aware of its presence. I stayed completely still for what seemed like ages, and I somehow eventually fell back asleep. The following day, I made a call to have the house blessed. Thank God it worked, and nothing ever happened again. My brother confided in me years later that he used to hear someone calling his name in that house. But whenever he'd ask our parents if they'd called him, they'd tell him that they hadn't. Through my younger years, 7 to 12, my mother dated a guy very on and off, which I think mostly had to do with him being in the Army and staying with his family in Laredo, Texas whenever he was home. Either way, he invited us to visit his cousin's summer cabin in Monterrey, Mexico for a weekend, so we did. The cabin was very ranch style, longer in one dimension and shorter than the other, so it was built like an architectural rectangle. On one far side of the building, think of this as an aerial view, was the kitchen, and next to it was the living room. Attached to the living room was a long, slender hallway, connected to the bedrooms on each side, and a bathroom on one of the sides. The backyard was only accessible through the living room via a sliding door, and it started as a bit of a desert floor which met forest tree lines of dead or dying Monterey cypress trees. Meeting the tree line was an elevated hunting tower, which had its platform meeting the top of the vertical tree line. On our way to the cabin, my mom's boyfriend was telling us about a cursed legend of the witches of Monterey. Apparently, they'd been haunting the mountainous area for generations, and they were his childhood versions of La Lenora. Clearly, he was just trying to scare us from the get-go, and me being so young, I was eating it up like candy. We got to the cabin in the late evening, so we decided to stay in for the night and watch M. Night Shyamalan's The Lady in the Water. After the movie, my mom's boyfriend asked me to go get something from the bedroom for him, and as I was halfway down the hallway, he turned the lights off on me. Let me remind you, this was a very rural part of Mexico, so the dark was dark. And with all the scary stories and all at the time scary movie, I was spooked and I froze. My mom's boyfriend began to make your stereotypical ghost noises and taunted me to go deeper into the dark hallway. But I was so petrified, I remember just standing there, frozen in fear. Long story short, my mother got him and he turned the lights back on. They comforted me, and after a few apologies, we all went to bed. I can't remember how I slept that night, but I honestly wish I did. The next day, we did basic tourist shit. Went to a bazaar, embraced the city's beautiful mountain range, which seemed to hug the city. We ate authentic Mexican food and finished the main hub of the city. When the day was all done, we decided to call it and we went back to the cabin. All these details, they're important to me because I remember the night before so vividly, yet can't remember anything else about this night other than what I'm going to write about. I was in the living room of the cabin, and I remember my mom's boyfriend was there with me. He asked if I wanted to go up into the hunting tower out back, and I innocently said yes. I remember following him through the back door of the living room, and I remember him walking ahead and turning back to wave me towards him. I took it as he was trying to help me keep up and follow him. I watched him climb up the ladder of the hunting tower, and then I heard a voice behind me.
Hey,
My name.
where are you going?
It was my mom's boyfriend behind me, asking where I was going. I turned back around to look at the hunting tower along the tree line, and no one was there. Nothing was. Not an animal, not my mother, not a specter, nothing. Fast forward a few years ago, my now wife and I are still dating at the time, and we're sharing ghost experiences with one another. And yes, I do have one other ghost experience in my life that I believe to be genuine as well. I told her about this experience in Monterey, and I'll never forget the cold or pale look on her face when I told her. She's from a Mexican family as well, and this legend of the witches of Monterey, it's a very real thing for her as well. The truly scary part, I was telling her this story on a Friday, and according to what her family told her growing up, Friday is a forbidden day to talk about them, because that's the one day of the week they're the most powerful. Apparently, they never forget their prey and use that day as a lure towards what they lost. Initially, I thought, bullshit. But I can't begin to express how many Fridays my wife had to stop me because I had randomly brought up the story on a Friday. Maybe it was subconscious, I don't know. Has anyone ever experienced something like this? If not, I'd still like feedback, comments, concerns. Thanks for reading my story. Almost 10 years ago, my family took a vacation to the Hawaiian Islands, specifically the Big Island. The hotel we stayed at was a nice one. It was a Sheraton hotel, but I know there was another name before it, like Kona or King. But I don't remember anyone telling me or anyone recalling it being haunted or not. Either way, we were there for about 5 days total. On day 3, or night 3, something happened that made the next 2 days a bit different, to say the least. Sleeping got harder and became something I tried in the afternoons. Even then, didn't get much sleep. On the 3rd night, I was with my cousin in the master bedroom of my parents' suite, watching a movie, and at some point, we fell asleep. That night, my parents had essentially given their room or suite to the kids, and the adults were in the adjoining room that my aunt and uncle had reserved. My cousin was still asleep, but I had woken up. It sounded like my little brother and my little cousins had fallen asleep too. I got up and I walked around the room to make sure that everyone was asleep, and I went to turn off the TV in the living room, which was blaring some sort of infomercial. As soon as I shut it off, I heard some sort of soft, muffled sound. It sounded like a group of people. I immediately assumed it was my parents or the adults having a late night, but I hadn't heard them a moment ago in the master bedroom, so I just walked over to the wall that was shared with the other suite, and that's when I saw that it was past 3 a.m. At first, I only thought it was strange that they would be awake so late, but shortly after making it to the wall, I realized the sound had ceased. It was silent throughout both our suite and theirs. But as I walked back to the master bedroom, I heard the low, soft mumble return, and it was as though they were just in the other room, the living room behind me. Turning around, I could see that nothing had changed. No one was awake, and the TV remained off. So I chalked it up to being tired, and I just went back to bed. Possibly someone was around us, neighbors even. As I tried to fall back asleep, I couldn't drown it out. I remember putting a pillow over my head just to try to make the sound go away. Eventually, it must have been even the slightest successful because it was morning. I told my parents about the whole ordeal, and they basically told me that this was a vacation spot. They were sure that it could have been somebody below us even, just younger people having a good time. I didn't agree with them, but what was I going to do about it? That night, I asked my cousin to stay over again. She was for sure more interested in what I had told her than afraid. At least, she didn't dismiss me entirely. So, she stayed and we got to use the living room as our area for the night. My aunt and uncle hosted the younger kids. Because I was so tired, I fell asleep before we could even really start the movie we picked. but I was awoken by my cousin around midnight. She was holding her index finger to her mouth and using her other hand to point to her ear. I listened, and I heard what sounded like whispering. It was close to us, but no one was near us. We laid there, one ear up, and just listened. It was incredibly unsettling, but somehow, my cousin, not being afraid, allowed me to sort of calm down. It was almost the sound of children, but there were so many of them, it was hard to tell if they were all children or some sort of mix of all types of voices. I asked out loud, what could it be? My cousin said, "Ghosts, Kyla. Ghost whispers. I mean, right?" It eventually stopped, and then it would come back. It definitely didn't sound like neighbors. I don't know what it was, but it creeped me out enough to keep me awake. I remember staring at the TV for hours. Random old black and white TV shows just running across the screen. I wasn't really watching as much as keeping myself distracted with the sound and visuals. The last day, I was pretty tired. I thought I would catch up on some sleep before a super fun luau that night. At first, I thought it was just sleepiness or even dreaming a little. I heard loud footsteps. It sounded like someone wearing large, heavy boots or heavy shoes, carrying heavy things. I'd sort of dozed off, but it appeared a few more times. Eventually, I went to shut the door because I wanted to sleep, and I had thought that everybody had been out for a few hours. Closing the door, I realized that I was alone. But suddenly, I feel a bit of air rush towards me. I see the papers on the desk beside me whoosh in the air. I hear what sounds like metal on metal, clashing 3 or 4 times, and then nothing. I had slammed the door almost immediately and was standing on the other side. I really have no idea how to explain that one any better than I just have there. But holy hell, it was incredibly scary. I buried myself in the large bed and mess of comforters, and I tried to get some sleep. That was the last experience I had there, thankfully. I realize all these things happened at times that I was tired, but at a certain point, it feels like you can only blame so much on being tired. Before heading out that night, I couldn't help but notice that none of the windows actually opened in the room. The papers, which had flown about earlier, were still thrown about. My parents had even asked if I'd knocked those over and forgotten to pick them up. No, I hadn't, I told them. But I didn't bother telling them what exactly had. I was still trying to wrap my own head around that idea. So, that's my experience. Has anyone ever had one like it? I'd be so curious to know if I'm alone in this or not. Before I call bullshit on my coworker, I'm wondering if any of my UK friends could chime in and tell me if this chick is just crazy, or if she's telling the truth. Tara, my coworker, moved to Tampa from York, England last year. On Saturday, we have an office party and she flirtatiously requests for a ride home. We both live in the same town just outside of the metropolitan area. I'm a lesbian. She might be. I don't know. But I decide to see where things go and test my feelers. We're driving and she unbuckles her seatbelt, turning her body, and puts her feet in my lap as I'm driving. She's pretty short, so her maneuver is less life-threatening and more of a positive sign that my intuitions were correct. She's facing me to talk. As she's asking about my childhood and other questions to fill the time, I place my right hand on her left foot, and as my fingers rub across her skin, I feel a small circular scar on the back of her ankle. about the size of a $50, with impressions like a tiny buzzsaw was rolled around her ankle. I ask how she got the scar, and she tells me when she was a little girl in York, she'd ride her bike to get around her small suburban town. One day, a few meters from leaving her house, she came upon a trail that looked to have been recently cut. Instead of riding her bike around this large wooded park that separated her from the town, this trail, she thought, looked like it led right through. The tree park was only about a football field size, but having to ride your bike all the way around always made it seem bigger. Seeing this freshly cut path was an exciting discovery. She was eager to explore. The tree canopies above gave the trail shade and provided a nice escape from the summer sun. Riding her bike along the dirt path, she noticed a big, hollowed tree. Inside the large knot of this tree, Tara says she saw 2 fairies fluttering in and out. She said that they were as tall as a can of fizzy drink. For my North American friends, fizzy drink is a soda pop. Well, she stopped her bike and watched these 2 fairies flying back and forth from the tree, returning sticks and nuts to the hollowed knot. Tara says that she stood there for a good 10 minutes, mesmerized by their sparkling wings and little human-like bodies fluttering around. On one of the trips these fairies made, little Tara noticed it struggling with a big, leafy branch. The fairy's wings flapped and flapped, trying to pull this large branch up, eventually collapsing in the grass next to the tree from exhaustion. The branch was giant compared to the fairy, but a twig for Tara's size. Seeing this tired little creature compelled her to get off of her bike and help. She says that she walked over and picked up the branch, and the other fairy appeared from behind the tree, a few inches from her face. Its face wasn't like storybooks portray, though. Absent of beauty was this creature. Its features more resembled a troll, and its clothes were not elegant. Primitive garments, only worn to protect its skin from the natural surroundings. The fairy didn't speak, but Tara knew by its glare and almost telepathic energy that she'd fucked up. She set the branch down and started to walk back towards her bike. The fairy lets her get 3 or 4 steps before its wings start fluttering and it begins to chase Tara. She turns and runs the last couple of feet towards her bike. But as she's jumping on and about to slide her kickstand up, she feels a searing hot pain in the back of her ankle. Looking down, Tara's horrified to see that the fae has bitten her and is still attached to her leg by its nasty little razor-sharp teeth, each one sinking deeper as she tried to kick it off. Eventually, one desperate swing of her leg launches the fairy off her ankle, giving Tara a chance to pedal away. She rode her bike back home in agony, and the bite became infected. Her mother thought that she'd scraped herself on something, but her grandmother was the only one that believed her story. To add to her outlandish claim, she concludes her story by saying when her and her dad went out to see where it happened, the trail was gone. It was back to a regular tree park that it had always been. What do you think? I don't know if I'm on her mom's side or her grandma's. Is there any validity to her story? Or is this a red flag that I may not want to pursue? So I've got a lot of vivid memories as a child. Most of them are places I went that I won't forget. Disney World is one of those places. Also, my parents took me and my little brother to the landmark Forest Adventure Park when I was about 7 or 8. That one's in Scotland, which is where my family split their time until I was about in the 3rd grade, and that's when we moved to Long Island permanently. Just before our last visit to Scotland, at least the last one which I was a child, I have another vivid memory. This one's not as tangible as a theme park, though. It's a bit fantastic. But I'd still seen it with my own eyes, and I still remember it. My father had been busy getting things in order for the big trip, so my mother took me and my little brother to the beach near our temporary home. The area was incredibly beautiful, and Mother even told us that we might see dolphins out there. To get to the beach, it was a small hike. You couldn't just drive your car down there. It may sound odd, but my mother allowed me to run ahead of her and my little brother for a bit. But I grew up next to the ocean, and we spent a great deal of time outside with both my mother and father. My younger brother stayed behind and walked with my mother as I ran ahead. I was picking up rocks, looking at every tree, and I was already eyeing the ground for any lost seashells. I was the first one to hit the shore. I knew I could run up to it and even go in for a bit if I wanted to, as long as I could still touch the bottom and my mother could see me go in. I opted to stay out of the water, and I was combing the shore for seashells. I saw this stack of rocks that was calling my name. I yelled to my mom that I wanted to check out the cluster of rocks further down the beach. She waved me on, and so I went. As I reached the rocks, I climbed over a few smaller ones to get a good viewpoint from the larger one. I was surprised when I reached the place to climb to the larger rock, and I saw a boy. He was probably my younger brother's age because he was just so small, but he didn't look like anyone I'd ever seen in my life. Being a friendly child, I asked the boy what he was doing over here. Had he found any seashells? The boy didn't speak. He smiled, and then suddenly he brandished a few seashells before handing them to me. Surprised, I held out my small carrier I'd brought to hold shells, a small tin lunchbox. As he placed them in the tin, I couldn't help but notice how pale his skin was. Truly, his skin was more blue, almost matching the color of the water itself. His hair looked to be made of something slimy and green. Possibly it was just seaweed stuck in his hair. I couldn't be sure. It was so strange. I still can't be sure. I thanked the boy, and he still said nothing. As I looked into his eyes, I couldn't help but notice that they were rather dark. Just black circles, really, as if he only had pupils. I started to feel a little bit uneasy about what I was seeing, but I knew it wasn't kind to react to the way people look. So I thanked the boy again, and just as I was going to hop down, he jumped into the water. He seemed to be down there for a long time. So long I almost left to grab help, but he surfaced. He climbed the rocks with some sort of ease that I didn't even know was possible. He handed me 3 more shells. He stared into my eyes, but he said nothing. I was uneasy again. I started to thank the boy again and again, but I couldn't stay. I couldn't watch him do that again. It didn't feel like I should stay. I hopped down from the rocks, and it wasn't until I was walking away that the boy said something. But the voice wasn't what I expected, and he wasn't speaking English. I stopped and turned around. I looked up, and there was what looked like the tail end of a seal, and then that disappeared into the water. I could hear a splash. Curious, I started to head back over to the rocks, but my mother called for me, telling me it was time to meet my father. As I was walking back, I told my mother about the blue boy by the rocks and the seal. She told me that she had watched me the whole time. She hadn't seen a boy or a seal. I insisted there was, even asking her to go look, but she dismissed this, saying we needed to meet my father. Sure, I had an active imagination as a kid, what kid doesn't, but I know the difference between the things I invented and the things that, honestly, my mind couldn't even begin to invent at that age. I don't know. I've always been a bit into mythology, but I don't think that even started until after this experience. when I'd casually search for answers throughout my life. I've read about certain fae that exist close to water, especially in areas of Scotland and all throughout the UK. Selkies. I don't know a lot about them, but I know that others have claimed to see the creatures as well. People describe them in different ways. Many say that they have a sort of naughty nature, meaning they like the idea of luring humans to their death. Others say that they're simply creatures who can take on the form of a seal and a human, and that they typically only show themselves to children. I suppose it could have been just a strange-looking boy, but he was awfully good at swimming and climbing. And that hair, I can't forget how strange his hair was. To this day, my mother claims I was seeing things, but what's so silly about that is I had never just seen anything before. So, what do you think? Did I encounter a Selkie?